Okay, so here we are. This is the encore presentation of the shiur at Temurah number one. I'm going to start by taking maybe 5 minutes to go over very broad things from the pre-introductory shiur last semester, just so we can set some basic themes that probably won't play out this week, but hopefully will play out in the course of some of the coming sugyot, and then we'll move on to analyzing the Rashi on the first sugya. Based on yesterday, I would say that we'll probably get to raise the questions this week and hope that we can get to solutions sometime next week. Okay, so let me. Okay, that's things everybody were expecting. I'm going to put the source here in the chat once more, just in case Rennie hasn't have it yet. And let's share a screen, and we'll go. Okay, so the two major themes that we set out earlier that I'm just going to assert as opposed to try to prove conclusively in the course of this year. One is that Temurah is a reaction to an attempt to undo the chait of the Eitz Hadas. Temurah is built on Lo Yivaker Ben Tov L'Ra, and the chait of the Eitz Hadas is, of course, knowledge of Tov L'Ra. And that's built on a broader theory that korbanot are the way back into Gan Eden. And so Temurah in some ways the capstone of korbanot. We'll see at the very end of Sefer Vayikra. And so therefore, if the thesis is that all of Sefer Vayikra as the Sefer korbanot is supposed to try and get you back to Gan Eden, so it ends perfectly with Temurah, which is Lo Yivaker Ben Tov L'Ra V'Ra L'Tov. And we pointed out last semester, the fun of it would be that then Temurah would be the way to understand Temurah, the way to make it a mishpat in classical Rashi terminology is to understand that it is the ur-chok. And then I try to figure out if you take the position darshan and tam likra, so how do you darshan the reason of something which is supposed to show you irrationality? Okay, that's a fun paradox that I hope we'll find ways of playing out in the course of this year. The second is that the model for the agadic model for Temurah is the Akedah. And so I put up the medrash that really fascinated me to start with. This is that so there are two positions. Yudan B'Shem Rav Benaya says that what we want is Haviroed Damo Shel Ayel Zeh Ilu Damo Shel Yitzchak B'nei. Right, so the Ayel replaces Yitzchak, whereas Rav Pinchas B'Shem Rav Benaya, also the different versions where where the tridents are changed, says crafty Yitzchak b'nei tchila v'achar kach crafty et ayel tachtav. Okay, so one version the ayel replaces Yitzchak, and the other version the ayel somehow serves as both itself and Yitzchak. So the problem is that in Hilchos Temurah we have a pasuk which says V'hayahu Ismar Soya Kodesh. That what goes on in Temurah is that both of them become Kodesh, and yet the first position, which says, "I want you to see the ayal as if it's replaced Yitzchak," that the source it quotes to prove itself is the Mishnah, which teaches you what languages create Temurah. So it has to be possible to understand Temurah as creating both these outcomes. One we should call replacement, the other we should call addition. Lamdishli, what I tried to say is that instead of thinking about it as replacement, we should think about it as a transfer of the kedusha. Right, that Yitzchak has the kedusha, and now the kedusha of Yitzchak is transferred. And now the ayal is Yitzchak, and therefore, if you transfer the ayal, it's as if you sacrifice Yitzchak. And the other way, it's an extension of the kedusha, and that was built on a broader thesis that Temurah is really a form of meila, and we'll see another thing about that in a moment. But still, the halacha of Temurah is that they both become kodesh. So the first part of this medrash is still puzzling, which seems to view it as a replacement. So we'll have to see whether there's some kind of shadow of this idea that really Temurah works in that A replaces B, right? Because the Pashut Balbachish explanation is that Temurah doesn't work, right? It's just right, you just get penalized, right? Right? You were supposed to sacrifice Yitzchak, right? If the Akedah really were in Hilchos Temurah, you're supposed to sacrifice Yitzchak. You didn't. Tough, you have to, right? You try to avoid sacrifice. Tough, you have to sacrifice Yitzchak anyway. And by the way, this thing you try to use to replace Yitzchak, it doesn't replace Yitzchak. It just becomes Kadosh too. In this Midrash, there's no question that it replaces or becomes part of Yitzchak in some way. It works. It just doesn't have the consequence you want it to. Okay, so those are my two big things. One is a model. One is that we're talking about an anti-Eitz Hadas, and the other is that the Akeda is the model, and because the Akeda is the model, that tells you that that in some way the Temurah has to work, and the only thing is that although Temurah doesn't work in the sense that you want it to, which is that it doesn't allow you to evade the the source sheet's in the chat again. Temurah doesn't allow you to evade the status of the original one. I won't even say sacrifice because we'll see in a moment that that's not obvious. Temurah doesn't desacralize the original, but to say that Temurah does nothing and all we do is fine you, that seems to me incompatible with the analogy to the Akeda. Okay. So now let's go start looking at our specifics. So we're going to start by looking at the whole parak in which Temurah appears. Temurah appears in Chumash. Temurah appears twice Temurah appears twice in Chumash within several psukim each other in the last parak of Sefer Vayikra. So let's take a look at how the whole last parak of Sefer Vayikra is structured. It begins as follows. Okay, we start with Vayidaber Shalom Shalemor. The Brel B'Yisrael Mar Tolehem. We have a long parsha of Arachim. Okay, Arachim, right? You take a neder, and it begins by talking about people. And each of these cases, right, in males and females, in each case we assign a specific monetary value when you take a neder regarding a person. And that's the whole first thing. Then we go to the Behema. And you expect, okay, now we'll assign values for behemoth, but we don't. Right? Sort of ironically, we only assign fixed values to human beings. Right? You can figure out yourself like how you justify that, and then I'm not going to deal with the gender issue. But when we shift from human beings to it's v'im behema asher yakriv mimenu korban l'Hashem, so if it's an animal which is sacrificable, then everything you give, again, we're not going to do a close midrash halacha l'Hashem yeh kodesh. Lo yachlifenav lo yamiroto. You're not allowed to. I shouldn't say you're not allowed to. You can't be cholefit, and you can't be machlifit, and you can't be memirit. Tov b'ra rav b'tov. That's that language again. Im hamir yamir be'imam. And if you do it, then vayahu is muraso yakodesh. Okay, so the first thing we do is we say when we it sounds like we're setting up a parallel. There's arachin for human beings. There's behema. It turns out there's arachin for behema also, because we'll discover that for behema tmeya, surely akriv mimenu kurban l'Hashem. So then you have a non-objective arachin. You have the kohen being a richit, and there we define it as what baricho kohen bein tovu bein ra. Okay, so in terms of human beings, it's all arachin. In terms of behemos, there are two categories. One of which is arachin, but it's arachin in the exact antithesis of the arachin of human being. It's arachin which we evaluate each behema independently, and it's up to the kohen's judgment. And that's phrased as bein tov bein ra. So one way of thinking about Temurah is that Temurah is anti-arachin. Okay, so see if that's useful, right? That arachin sets values and Temurah. Right, Temurah refuses to set value, and then possibly a consequence of that. Although it seems to me on a different axis, but I haven't figured out exactly how. On the sheet I use opposite as an anti-parallel, but I'm not sure those are attempts to convey a visual, some kind of visual or geometric metaphor. It doesn't really work, but I'm just trying to convey. I think it's a little different. The other way to frame it is at the end of arachin, you have of the arachin of the behemoth tameh, you have the im gaol yigalena v'yasaf chamishito al arkecha. So if you dedicate something, so you can exchange it for money, but if you exchange it for money, then you have to add a fifth. So another way of framing Temurah is not that Temurah is the anti-arachin, but that Temurah tells you can't do geula. As opposed, right, geula is a way in which you can remove the kedusha of something by paying for it. Right. So really, right, arachin sounds like right when you didn't really make it kodesh. You did was you made its value kodesh. I would say no, but Temurah occurs when something was actually made kodesh. Geula says you made it kodesh, but you can undo that kedusha, and Temurah says you can't undo that kedusha. Now maybe that's connected. Maybe the reason you can't undo the kedusha is because the only way to do the kedusha is to replace the value, and this has no value. But it seems to me these are different axes. One is a right of thinking about it. One is that Temurah is anti-arachin, and the other is that it's not anti-arachin. What it is a denial of the possibility of gula. Okay, those are the two big things I want to point out. There's a third thing I want to point out, though, is that, again, we mentioned that there are two ways the Temurah shows up twice in this parak. Right, it goes at the end. It goes back to Temurah when we get to Maser Bakar Vatson. There again, we have. I'm sorry, this. I don't know if you were seeing this AI summary, but it keeps showing up on my screen. And it's not letting me navigate. Okay. Okay, so we go to the end of it, right? So there's Leiva Kerbet Tov the Rav Mirenu, right? So we have the same language, and in between there is one korban, which is im bechor yashir vaker l'Hashem b'ma le'yakdish, or at least there's one animal that is kodesh, and that animal doesn't. There's no mention about Temurah in it or not. It's possible that's related, that it's somehow different than Maser. Maser is random. Bechor is not random in the same way. So maybe it's not as subject to, I don't know. All I know is that the structure of it is we have a Temurah thing, we have a non-Temurah thing, and then we have a Temurah thing again. Okay. That's the end of Ikra. That's our introduction to Temurah. Again, the takeaways are Temurah versus Arachin, Temurah versus Geula. Somehow we skip Bechor in between the two other things of Temurah. Okay, moving on. So now we're going to go to the structure of the first parak of the Mishnah. Okay, the first parak of Mishnah Temurah begins with the line Hakol Memirin. Echad Anashim ve'Echad Nashim. This should immediately set off. Hang on a sec. Is Hakol only Echad Anashim ve'Echad Nashim? Right. Then, or is a redundancy, or do you need to include something else in Hakol? Or we'll see in a moment. There's a third option. Right. So Hakol Memirim Echad Nashim ve'Echad Nashim. That's immediately followed by Losh Adam Rashai L'Hamir Elash Im Hamir Mumar V'Sofeget Arba'im. So that's an odd framing. Everyone, right? It's all like this, but it's not. So that's a right. So that's a very odd structure, and we have to try and figure out why would you write it that way. Okay, then we go through the structure of the Mishnah. So it's followed by the Kohanim are Memir X, Israelim are Memir Y. Kohanim cannot be Memir these three things, and then we discover one of the things they can't be Memir is the Bechor. There's a whole discussion of that. Okay, so that's exactly what we would expect based on the Psukim, that after we apply it toward everything, we say, hang on a sec, not Bechor, because Bechor is in the middle, and we have to figure out where Chatat and Hasham fit in this scheme. I'm just going to point out that this is one place where the Mishnah is paying close attention to the Psukim, it seems. Okay, then we have right. Then we have after we have this list of things that of which people can be memir what following a kol memirim. Then we say apparently back to everybody. Everybody can be memir. Bakar latzon so bakar, right? And that's much of the rest of the parak. Then we get to things that you can't be memir. Okay, and that takes us to over here. So the question I'm asking is, it could be that the way we read this is Hakol Memirim, and this Memirim just goes back to that Hakol. There's an implicit Hakol Memirim here. Hakol Memirim Echad Nashim V'Echad Nashim, right? What are the Memir? Hakol Memirim Akar Etzon, Hakol Memirim Echad V'Shnayim, but Ein Memirim, right? Merely means Hakol Ein Memirim. Okay, and that way we understand exactly how the Mishnah is structured. It starts by saying everybody's Memir. Okay, not everybody is Memir everything, because Kohanim can only be Memir this, and Israeli can be Memir this, but everybody can be Memir the following list. then there's an interjection, which seems, which is literally unrelated news, right? Which gets us off to other topics. Ena meduma medamea, ena mechumas mechametz, ena mayim shuvim, and the purpose of all that in the structure is to get us back to Temurah. So we eventually get back to Temurah. Eventually get back to Temurah at the end of that list, where we say v'lo havlados, right? Where the question is whether you have Temurah, whether the Temurah can itself make Temurah. Okay, right? Whether the thing the animal which you made as which you attempted to designate as a replacement. What if you attempt to designate something as a replacement for the replacement? And there's a machloket Tanan about that, which presumably will also tie into our question about the Akedah. And now we're back in Temurah. And having gotten back to Temurah, now we go to a list of things things that do and don't affect this thing of Temurah. Right? Afod and menachot. Right, again, we're not going to talk about now whether that's the thing that you're replacing or the thing that's replaced, or they both have to be the same, which is reasonable. Right, so Afod and menachot don't have an issue of Temurah because only said about Beimat HaTzibur. Shutafim can't. Shutafim don't make Temurah, so that's really an animal belonging to Shutafim cannot become Temurah. Korban Berek Abayit can't do Temurah. Okay, why does this matter to me? Because we could say as follows, that Akol Memirin doesn't mean everybody makes Temurah, and then that's continued over here. It could be that everything is made Temurah. Both men and women can make it Temurah. And then we have the next relationship. The next section is built off Echad Anashim Be'echad Nashim. Right? So who is it that can make everything Temurah? And then we modify, when we said everything can make Temurah, really not everything can be made Temurah. Ein Memirin is going back to the things that we don't make Temurah. And the rest of it is all about the things we do and don't make Temurah. Right? So fundamentally, I think you can understand the structure of the parak either way, either as a kol memirim meaning everybody can be memir, or a kol memirim is everything can be made into Temurah, or everything can effectuate the halachot of Temurah if you attempt to replace them. Right. So I just want to put out both possibilities, and then we go to the sugi. We'll have to see if it's clear that we're going with one or the other. And since a lot of our work is going to be constructing havaminas, so it doesn't have to be that any of that this is a pshat. It just has to be useful to us. It just has to be something that somebody considers for a moment could be pshat, something that's worth at least saying is wrong. Okay. All right. Okay. So now let's go to the Mishnah. So the Mishnah begins a kol emir mechad nashim bechad nashim lo shadam rashai l'hamir ela shem emir mumar v'sofeget arba'im. So I'm trying to understand, what does this structure look like? Like, what does it mean when you say everything, and then when you say halacha, and you say that halacha, it's not what you thought. And that's a peculiar structure. So what's the logical form that's intended? Partly I want to know is, can I figure out what kind of mistake would I have made without the second line? So I gave you three analogies. We'll see that there's a fourth one that Will Friedman came up with in the first year that I think is really directly on point, but won't change the essential argument. But he should get credit because I didn't have it. There are other examples, but I missed his, which I should have cited. So Rosh Hashanah, we have the following. Right? So father and son both see the new moon. They should go to Yerushalayim to tell the Beit Din, so we have Kiddush HaChodesh. Lo shemistarfin ze im ze, ela shim bipasel echad mehen yistaref hasheni im acher. Right? So that's roughly the same structure. Lo, right? Lo ela. So here I think you can see the two possibilities. Right? Possibility one is, I thought that the father and son should go see the new moon. That would imply that the father and son together can testify. So the Mishnah tells us, no, when I said they should go, I did not mean to imply they both can testify. I just meant to imply that they should both go because it's worthwhile going, even though they can't both testify. Now, that would leave an interesting possibility because it turns out that's controversial. Rabbi Shimon actually says that a father and son and all relatives can testify. So it might be that we could explain what happens in this structure is that we have a first statement, which is the sort of the original statement, and then is modified by the following machloket. And that would give us a very nice diachronic explanation of what happened. The original text is and then somebody puts in not because they can both testify, and then Rabbi Shimon, who's the original author, right, says no, really meant you could testify. Rabbi Shimon holds what the original statement meant. If that were the case, then the structure is what the structure tells you is that the lo ella is supposed to correct a legal error. And it would be better if in each case, if we could find a position which actually held like the legal error that line is supposed to correct. We don't have, that I know of, such a position in Temurah, but it would be interesting to claim such a position. There's that there's some kind of halachic dispute which either holds that Adam is Rashai Hamir, or that if he's Memir, it's not Mumar, or that you're not so faggot to Arba'im. Right? That would be the best way to come out with it. But even if we don't have such a line, right? So that was a big speculation. It tells us that there's some kind of halachic error that I'm looking for. However, if we look at the other two examples here, Bavakama and Kritut, so there Lo Shadam Rashai, right? Sorry, there the structure Lo Ella is clear, right? So we have, let's say, Rodef Shay Rodef Achar Rodef Latzil, right? So you have A chasing B, and then C comes in to chase B in order to save A, and C, who is trying to save A, breaks things belonging to other, to yet fourth parties, fifth parties, whatever, in the process of trying to kill B to save A. So they're patur. And then the Mishnah comes in and says, V'lo min hadin, they're not patur because of a technicality in Hilchos Nezikin. Elash imiyata omer came, but if you were to say that they're chayav, ein lech adam shemetzil et chaviro min hanirdaf. Okay, and going right, and that the same structure appears in Kritut, right, where we say that the reason that both are chayav in that case, it doesn't matter to us what the case is not because of the halacha, but rather because if you were to say patur, then you would have a consequence we don't want. Okay, the other case is Yoma is a sugya. Sorry, Mishnah Yoma Perik Bet. Let's see if I put it up for myself on Sfaria. Let's find it again. Here we are. All right, so sorry, Yoma Perik Zion Pasuk Bet. It says that if you we're in the Yom Kippur ritual. If you see a Kohen Gadol when he's Korei the Torah, you don't see the par and the Seir Nisrafim. And if you see the par and the Seir Nisrafim, you can't see the Kohen Gadol when he's reading. The Lo Mipnei Sheino Rashai, they're even after the word Rashai. The reason is not because you're not allowed to see them both. Ela Shaita Derech Rechoka Umelechet Shnehen Shaveh Kechad. It's because they happen at the same time. So it's just a consequence. Okay, so what you get from all three of these, and there are other examples, but I think that those three will suffice, is that the low Ella structure doesn't tell you in any of those cases to correct a legal havamina. It tells you to correct a rationale havamina. Right? I would have thought that this is I would have thought that this is why the halacha is. I would have thought it's because it's a din nezikin. It's not a din nezikin. It's a derabanan decree. I would have thought, right? That's what all of those are. And then when you go back, you can look and say, oh, maybe that's what happened in Rosh Hashanah also. Right? That Rosh Hashanah, it happens that it has a legal consequence, but it makes a lot of sense to say that we're really doing it. I thought the rationale for going was that you could testify together, And it turns out the rationale for going is not right, is different. It's that right, it's that you can go and join other people. So it's possible to say that the whole that the structure always means that we're missing a rationale, that we're changing a rationale. The havamina that we're changing is havamina about the rationale and not about the din. And in that case, when we try and explain our Mishnah Kol also, we should try right. What we're looking for is a change of rationale, not a change of din. Okay, so I want to have those possibilities. Now we should, as we're starting to assemble possibilities in our head, right? So we have the question of grammatically of what a kol memirin means, and we have the question of what the structure of kol nosha dam rashai hamir means as well. Okay, brief pause methodologically, right? So what I'm trying to do and trying to model is that in order to understand what Rashi says, we have to have all the as many possibilities as possible in our head in advance. So as opposed to just saying, "Oh, this is what Rashi says," we have a universe of choices that Rashi's making, and it might be that there are places where we don't, right? Because if we want to understand, right, I'm going to work on the presumption that Rashi only says things that matter. So to understand why it matters, we have to understand what the options are, and it'd be easy and helpful if Rashi is choosing among all the options we set in advance. But we're going to see that unfortunately, while the methodology I think is still sound, it's not going to help. We're still okay. So here we go. Here's the Mishnah. Here's what Rashi says. First, Rashi says, "Akol mirin beimat chulin zu tachat zu shel hektish." Okay, that's what Temurah is. Why does Rashi have to say it? So maybe nobody knew what Temurah is. So Rashi is coming and giving you a basic introduction to the Masechta. Okay, could be. All the ambiguity is not even resolved because it depends, right? Because if I read it, it's like if I read it across the break between alleged dibur hamatchil, then Rashi reads it as a kol mirin beimat chulin zu tachas shelektish. If I want to read it as the second way, it's a kol mirin. What does that mean? Mirin means when you have what's included in a kol when you read a behema of chulin versus a behema of hektish. That's the way it always works. So I don't think Rashi even resolves that ambiguity. So I am baffled as to why Rashi writes this. Okay. Lo shadam rashai lahamir. On the second line, Rashi says, "Zaktiv lo yamir." Okay, that's nice to know. That's why people aren't rashai lahamir, because there's a pasuk that says explicitly, "You're not rashai lahamir." Really, they're two psukim, but let's assume we're talking about the general one and not the one about Maser Behema. Fine. That's useful because it doesn't tell me anything about the relationship between the first and the second lines. Also, just go where Rashi doesn't feel a need to explain is echad nashim ve'echad nashim. Okay, that's obvious. Good. Mumar, what does that mean? This mumar? Dimatfis Allah kedusha ushtehen kedushot. Again, that's what Temurah is. And the Sofeket Arba'im, Mishum Lavdul Yamir. What else? So essentially, right, all four of the Rashis on the Mishnah seem superfluous. Two of them even seem redundant with each other, where it's like Siv Lo Yamir and Mishum Lavdul Yamir. I don't know what any of these Rashis accomplish. I'm going to put this into a broader framework because I have a theory about what Rashi on the Mishnah does, which is not borne out here at all. So I'll just state it as a theory, and we'll see if it holds up at all. My theory generally is that Rashi on the Mishnah is intended to read the Mishnah so that you will understand it in the way the Gemara does when the Gemara first approaches it. And that means that Rashi on the Mishnah is going to explain according to the Havamin of the Gemara, not the Maskana. Because if he explains it according to the Maskana, then he's killing the Gemara. You will understand the question. So that's what I would like this to merge, but I don't have any framework. The best way to explain these Rashis maybe is if Rashi on the Mishnah were written as an independent work that doesn't require the Gemara, but that's untenable because of the many, many times Rashi says the Gemara Mefarij. So I am at this point thoroughly baffled. And I have this list of questions, and I don't know what any of these Rashis are doing. And with that, I'll go into the Gemara. None of the things that I set up to try and explain in advance have helped me do this. But what about the Gemara? Okay, so here we get to the Gemara. Let's look at the structure of the Gemara first, and then we'll talk about what we need to do with it. So the Gemara goes as follows: Hagufa kasha. Okay, there's an internal contradiction in the Mishnah. Amarta hakol memirin lechatchila. So first you say hakol memirin, which the Gemara assumes means that you can be memir lechatchila, whatever lechatchila means. Right, but lechatchila is something is a value you can assign to memirin. The Hadar Tani, and then afterwards in the Mishnah, it says Lo Shadam Rashayil Hamir, and then there's it's not the way we have in Vilna. It has the second line Ela Shem Himur Mamar. So we don't know whether the conclusion of this is the Evid relates to the first half, to the second half, or to all of them together. Okay, so now we set up our internal contradiction in the Mishnah. Right, the first phrase of the Mishnah is supposed to be Lechatchila. The second, something in the second line of the Mishnah tells us the Avad. We have ignored Echad Nashim ve'Echad Nashim again. And then the Gemara says, V'tizbra, what? Hakol Meir Lechatchila? You said that the first line is Lechatchila? And then, right, Adakashi Lachim Madnitin, but you're bothered, right? Then you're asking a question on the claim that's Lechatchila based on later in the Mishnah, Tikshi Lach Kra, Tichsiv Le'echli Fenav Le'amirato. Right? That line of the Mishnah is utterly impossible. Because there's a pasuk that says you can't do this. So what's your hava min lechatchila? Okay, that's an interesting structure. Right, where the Gemara just sort of rejects the hava mina entirely. So what are we supposed to think at this point? It's obviously b'diavad. What does b'diavad even mean in this context? Okay. Let's ask another question. So what should happen after this? Right? We have our structure. Right? I ask an internal contradiction. Then I say, no, your internal contradiction is ridiculous because your first assumption is absurd. So then so the next line should be one of two things. Either you're right, it's all b'diavad. Or no, actually, there's a way to read it as lechatchila. And here's how to read it as lechatchila. Rav Yehuda says the following. The Gemara is we have to consider as follows. Rav Yehuda, Hachi Katani. This is how we should paraphrase the Mishnah. Hakol matfisim b'tmurah echad nashim ve'echad nashim. Lo shadam rashai l'hamir sh'im hamir mumar v'sofeget arba'im. So let's start off on the simplest line as Rav Yehuda changes Hakol memirin to Hakol matfisim b'tmurah. Now, if Hakol memirin was reached the conclusion of Chatchila because of the structure of the verb, everyone can do X. Unfortunately, Ravida doesn't change the structure of the verb. Hakol Mefisin B'Temurah just expands Hakol Memirin into two words. But grammatically, it's identical. So how can Rabbi Yehuda be a response to the V'tizbra? And in fact, what is Rabbi Yehuda doing relative to what happened previously at all? And so it's not all clear how we structure the sugya at all, because the simplest way of reading the sugya is stira, challenge to the stira, and then we should put the stira back together again. But Rabbi Yehuda clearly isn't putting the stira back together again. It sounds like even if we get past that issue, that we should be finding a way to read Hakol Memirin as something other than Lechatchila, and that should require some kind of paraphrase that changes the grammar, but this paraphrase doesn't change the grammar. Also, if everything is built around Hakol Matfisim B'Temurah, why do we have to quote the whole Mishnah again? Just say Hakol Matfisim B'Temurah, end the conversation. I will note that I don't have any other example of a V'tizbra functioning this way as a where it's an additional kasha on the same axis as opposed to, in fact, rejecting something previous. So I am as confused in the Gemara as I was in Rashi on the Mishnah. And so here are all the issues set out. One is that if the Achikatani responds to the Tizbra, then it should defend the Kushir and resolving it. Right. If the fundamental problem is that a kol, this grammatical structure is Chatchila, how does the paraphrase solve it? Right. The question of whether the B'diavad line is which half of the B'diavad is line on. Now we'll add right. Also, this is the only case we have Adikashia, so that's not going to help me resolve the Tizbra at all. One of the things I should point out is that the word Ella is missing in the requote of the Mishnah. In our Mishnah, it's Ella Shim Hemir. It's not there in the requote. So we could come up with an alternative hypothesis that what is the key line of the paraphrase is not a kol matfisa b'tzmur at all. That's just random, and really what matters is whether you have an ella or not. I don't know how that would work, but since I don't understand how the first one works either, or I have to tell you that that's possible. Okay, those are my problems with the sugya. Let's see if Rashi solves any of them.
Can I ask a question about
Sure.
Tizbara?
Sure.
What would be a normal context for that?
Somebody reads the Mishnah in a particular way, not as a kushya, but just reads it a particular way, and somebody else says, "Hang on a sec, what? Really?" I think that's the usual way. I haven't gone through all the Tizbras and Shas. I was looking for one specifically like this, and I didn't find one like this. So if you find one that you think is useful analogy, there are 170 something or other, and I didn't succeed in doing them, and I have an excuse. My computer got left in New Haven let's say Shabbos with my Bar Ilan, so my research capacities have been my last minute tie everything up for the sugya is not at my best, but I don't think I would have gone through all of them anyway. What I went through was enough of them to be and to be sad and do some word proximity searches. I didn't find anything, but as I will found the Mishnah I missed, so you're welcome to come up with one before next week. Or in the content, if you have a Bar Ilan, you can find one that you think is analogous and bring it up in the rest of the shiur, because I'm missing it at this point. Okay, so continuing to try and understand the sugya before we get to Rashi's explanation. So we shouldn't work on the premise that Rashi has our text. Right, one of the things that goes wrong in reading Rashi is that we assume that Rashi has the Vilna Shas in front of him, and then we might totally misunderstand why he's saying what things are necessary. Maybe he has a different text. So let's look at what the other texts we know about are. So in Venice, we have a whole new line. Venice says, he gufakasha, amarta kol mirim, then lo shadam rashai diavid, and then v'hadratani lo shadam rashai lamir elishim hemir mamar diavid. 3 lines. So what do we do about the third line? You'll notice that the editor in Vilna decided just to cut out the first line and then to put the end of the second line in parentheses. Right now, you could imagine a girsa which read, "Amarta kol mirin lechatchila, lo shadam rashai lamir diavid, v'hadratani elishim hemir mamar diavid." Right, in which we derive separately from each of the 2 parts of the seifa diavid. You could imagine a text like that, or you could imagine, which I think is what the editors of Vilna Shas thought, and I think is probably correct, that you had 2 different versions of the line. One of which only has the first half of it, one of which has the whole line, one of which says Hadratani, one of which doesn't. And one of the lines is in the text, one of the lines is in the margin. And whoever did Venice copied both of them in, and Vilna re-separated them. But really, there are 2 versions of the line. And the difference between the 2 versions, A is the phrase Hadratani, and the other is whether you think the second half is essential or not. Okay. So we can be aware, of all those possible versions. Then, which I think is actually more important, there is Venice has Ella Amar Rav Yehuda as opposed to Amar Rav Yehuda. Now, Ella followed by a name Amora should be a replacement of a reading by a prior Amora. Right, so that's So putting an Ella would mean there's a whole other element missing in the sugya if you have Ella Amar Rav Yehuda. Okay, I just point that out. Okay, right. Also, we can just point out suspiciously. Hang on a second. Oh, there's a missing Ella in the last line. There's an added Ella in this line. Who knows how that happened? Okay. Vatican 118, 119. There are two, right? There are two Vatican manuscripts on it. Um, uh, Quotes the Mishnah in the Gemara again. That doesn't matter to us. Haguf Akasha, we're all good. It doesn't have the Hadratani. It just has Lo Shadam Rashai Lamir B'Diavad. So we get that. Okay, it has the first version of Venice. Right, there's no Hadratani, and the proof is from the first line Lo Shadam Rashai Lamir. That's the proof of B'Diavad. It doesn't have Rabbi Yehuda. It just says Amar Rebbe. It doesn't have the Ella. Fine. And really amusingly, it's missing the Hakol in the paraphrase. So that would be a cool paraphrase. We just said, "Oh, Hakol means l'chadchil. Let's just take the word Hakol out." I think it's very implausible, but I got to tell you, there is a version that does that, and it puts in a vav in front of the lo at the end, which could or could not be significant. Okay, those are the ones I gave you in full. Munich 95, right, which is the famous manuscript, the one that actually has all of Shas in it. So it has the first Ella, meaning that it's Ella Amar Rabbi Yehuda, and it also lacks the Ella Shem Hemir on the bottom, as we are in Vilna, as we've lacked every version we have. But Vatican 120, 121 has both Ellas and the below. And there's a thing called Xaviat Chet and Ferenz. They have the second Ella, but not the first one. Okay, so when we're trying to figure out what could Rashi's text have been, the options we know about are it could be that he has a text which derives b'diavad from the whole line. It could be as a text which derives b'diavad only from the first half of the line, Lo Shadam Rashai Lamir. It could be that he has Hadar Tani. It could be he doesn't have Hadar Tani. It could be he has Ella Amar of Yehuda. It could be as Ella Amar Rebbe somebody or other. It could be he has no Ella. And the text of the Mishnah and the paraphrase could be Vilo or just Lo, and it could be Ella Shem Hemir, or that could be left out. Those are all our possibilities going into Rashi on the Gemara. Okay, so here is Rashi actually on the Gemara. So I'm going to start with by not caring about what Rashi comments. I'm just going to try and see what Rashi's text is. So we do that in two ways. The first way I did it was I just took out, I took the Vilna Shas as my base, and I said, okay, let's see where Rashi changes the Vilna Shas. Wherever Rashi changes it, I'll change the Vilna Shas, but I'm assuming the text is otherwise exactly the same. Okay, so then we get that Rashi cuts off the line at Lo Shadam Rashai. Fine. He doesn't think the second half is significant. He does have Ella, but to be careful, he says Ella is Hachi Garsinan, so he puts the Ella in. But fascinatingly, he doesn't have Rav Yehuda at all. He cuts out the name Temurah. So without the name Temurah, you have Ella Hachi Katani. That's okay, because you don't need a prior name Temurah if it's the Stam doing it itself. But Rashi says Hachi Garsinan Ella Hachi Katani, so we don't know he doesn't tell us what Lo Garsinan is. So it could be Hachi Garsinan puts in the Ella, or it could be Hachi Garsinan takes out Rav Yehuda, or it could be it does both. Right? We don't know what Rashi's accomplishing. And then Rashi puts in the Vav of Vilo. We don't know whether he has the Ella because he cuts the quote of the Mishnah off at the Chule before he gets there. And okay, right. So the really interesting thing about Rashi's text, if we assume that Rashi's base is Vilna, or really his base is every textual witness that we have seen, right? All the manuscripts we have seen, Rashi, right? We disambiguate as to which half of the Mishnah he's talking about, and we put in an Ella and take it Rav Yehuda, and that's really all Rashi does. But we could do something much more radical. Right, we could say we'll do, I guess, without making various comparisons, they do sort of a Jacob Neusner approach. Let's assume that the only things in Rashi's text are the words he quotes. and everything else, right? Everything, right? We'll forget that we know anything about Vilna. We're trying to reconstruct the Gemara based on Rashi. So here's what that would look like. Lo shadam rashai diavad. That's the starting point. Rashi never says anything about, never says lechatchila at the beginning. V'yaksiv lo yachlifenav lo yamiroto. Hang on, it's like, how could it be diavad? But there's a pasuk that says it can't even be diavad. And then there's a line that Rashi says, and by the way, and also, hang on, the Mishnah says even the lechatchila. So this is just a mess. Right, so we can construct a text where all our technical terms really are missing. Right, are the Hagufa Kashya and the Hadar Tani and the Adikashya Lechman Nevitizbra, that's all missing because Rashi doesn't talk about a single one of them. Rashi throws in this line in Masnis and Katani, which we'll see like in a place like, what is that doing there? Right, it makes more sense if it's there because it's part of the text as opposed to a commentary. Okay, so we can construct a whole new thing, which Rashi which we respond El Hachi Katani, and everything is good. We still won't understand how the paraphrase works, but okay, that's what Rashi's commentary is for. But I just want to put out that there's a totally radical, right, that if we took the opposite approach, we could construct a version of the Gemara based on Rashi that is not subject to many of the problems we had reading the Gemara. And if Rashi doesn't explain any of those problems, we have to ask ourselves why. And I'm just setting it out as a methodological framework, right? There are two very different methodological frameworks. One methodological framework is we have a constellation of textual possibilities that we go into Rashi with, and we basically assume Rashi is working with one of the possibilities we have. Particularly here, we have 5 or 6 manuscripts, so what are the odds? And the other possibility is, no, Rashi is an independent witness much earlier than any other witnesses we have. Why should we assume that Rashi is within the framework of anybody else? Okay, and because that of course leaves much more space for creativity, so I can write something that makes perfect sense, right? But lectio difficilia and all that. Okay, having done that, now let's take a look. Right, I'm leaving my wild minimalist reconstruction for the moment, and yeah, I would say I'm only going to come back to it if it's the only way out. But I thought we should be aware because maybe at least we'll do things that are a little bit more radical than otherwise. Okay, here's Rashi integrated into the Gemara, and you have the Rashi above, which has all the Rashis, so you can make your decision as to whether you think I am correctly integrating Rashi into the Gemara or not. So Gufa Kasha Marta calling in the Chatila, Vadatani Lo Shadam Rashai Diavad, right? That's just text. So here's our first insertion. So in the Rashi we have Bitmiya first, but I think that if I'm right, that this line is an explanation, so the Bitmiya fits both of them together. It just happens that the way Rashi does it often is when he's doing a Bitmiya b'nichusa, he first basically punctuates the line and then he explains it. But if you're reading it consecutively, it's better to explain it and then punctuate it. Okay, so here's what he says. All right, so Lo Shadam, right, Vadatani, right, is b'diavad. Why? Why is it b'diavad? That means that lechatchila eno rashai l'hamir. Okay, so Rashi tells you that when we say Lo Shadam Rashai Diavad means as opposed to Lichatchila, right, meaning Lichatchila would have Rashus, but then he throws in a wild line. Aval Diavad Shapir Dami. So what you expect Rashi to say is, you're not allowed to do it Lichatchila, but if you did it, then it works. But Shapir Dami is not a language of and then it works. Right? Shapir Dami is a language and it's okay. So I'm very puzzled by how Rashi adds anything in here. Right? What is the explanation of Diavad help at all? Why does he have to throw this in about Diavad Shapir Dami? Right? We all understand what the problem is. And it seems like he's going out of his way here not to quote the pasuk, which would make sense because we're going to have Adikashilach Matnit and Katishilich Cross. So we could say that Rashi is trying to construct an explanation of the Gemara's first problem, which doesn't know that Temurah is Asr. Because otherwise, right, the pasuk's already there. So why is there another line? That assumes that Rashi has the whole elaborate version that we have. Okay, V'tizbara, Akol Mirin L'Chatchila, So what is this line doing here at all in Rashi? What do you mean? That's exactly what the Gemara tells you to leave aside. We don't care about the Mishnah. So I guess you could read this Rashi saying, well, you had a problem from the second half of the Mishnah on the first, but really you should ask a question from the pasuk. So how can the Mishnah say lechatchila? But why isn't the V'tizbra kasha on the b'diavad also? It's usher. Okay, so we have to try and find a way to read it that right to read it. But the problem I have all the way through is that Rashi is not helping. Rashi is making right. We keep on trying to explain Rashi, explain how Rashi is explaining it, and that's not where Rashi is supposed to explain it. Right? If Rashi's explanation requires more explanation than the original, then he hasn't helped us any. And I haven't found any way in which Rashi adds to understanding the Gemara yet. Okay, then we get to Hachi Garsina. Okay, right. So we have to figure out what the other Gersa was, and now watch what happens. Hakol Fisun Temurah Echad V'Chulei. So it's not about Anashim and Nashim. Kilomar. Okay, so now we know that Rashi has a problem in the Gemara because the Hachi Katani is right. Hachi Katani is Gemara's way of saying Kilomar. So Rashi's right. So Rashi's response to the Gemara's Kilomar is, oh, that needs another Kilomar. Okay, what's the other Kilomar? So right. So now Rashi should be trying to explain to us how Hakol Matfisin B'Temurah gets rid of the implication of lechatchila. So he tells you shetofesek kedusha Temurah bivhema bein al pi anashim bein al pi nashim. So all this time we've been going out of our way to right, everybody we've been ignoring echad nashim v'echad nashim, and all of a sudden here Rashi feels compelled to explain echad nashim v'echad nashim to mean bein al pi anashim bein al pi nashim. Why? Right, why doesn't he just keep the language of the Mishnah? Why does he have to throw this in here at all? Okay, let's assume that Rashi somehow helped us there, right? That shetofesek kedushas Temurah. Now, what he did, of course, right, was he left out the Hakol. Right, he said the Hakol Matfisin B'Temurah tells us that the Temurah is tofes. Bein al pinashim, bein al pinashim, and he left out the word hakol. So maybe that's what Rashi is doing, maybe not. Still very confused. Umashma. Rashi says, okay, so now we have hachi katani, kilomar, umashma. So Rashi says, umashma di'evid. How? So it tells you, kimo, dimhemira afilu isha, tefeses al pia kedusha Temurah. So it sounds like what Rashi is doing is claiming that the way we get the Temurah to be the Mishnah to mean even b'diavad is by bringing in women. So now we're reading Echad Nashim Echad Nashim in contrast to Hakol. But like, where did that come from? So this Rashi is. It seems to be trying to say something, but it's hopelessly trying to figure out, first of all, what does Kimo mean? And where does he get this idea that, right, first of all, I don't know what a mashma afilu, right? We're going to assume that afilu b'diavad is a mistake, because I don't know what afilu b'diavad means, right? As opposed to, right, what could be, what, right, what would the lesser thing in b'diavad mean? And then he says, "Kimod imhe mira afilu." What does he need that afilu isha? Everyone is b'diavad. Okay, so we'll just point out that that line in Rashi gets amended itself many times, right? The Achi Garsina line in Rashi gets amended many times. So we have umashma, that's amended to dimashma by the by the Bach. Now remember, the Bach has no manuscripts. The Bach is always just trying to make things make sense in his reading. Right, that's my Kabbalah from Dr. Salvation. So he changes umashma to dimashma. Okay, that makes it clear that it's the previous paraphrase that means this. Afilu di'evid, And now we have three different emendations. We have one person who changes kamo to nami. We have one person who changes kamo to kilomar, and one person who changes kamo to kigon. I don't know that it helps us anyway, but there we are. Right, so we have three. Right, I think that the reason we have all this ambiguity is that we don't know what it means. Right, why on earth does he throw this in? Okay, so that's right. So we have a problem establishing the text. Rashi, the text of the Gemara according to Rashi, or the problem of establishing the text of Rashi. And we don't have any panaceas yet that will help us understand everything regardless. So I have a couple more things to do just to set this right. So then here's the sugya with everything with everything together. Right, so you can try and put the Rashis on the Mishnah together with the Rashis on the Gemara and see if that helps. I don't yet see a way that it helps. It doesn't solve any of the redundancy in the Mishnah. It doesn't solve any of the structural problems in the Gemara. It doesn't disambiguate. So I have just to make sure we finish in the same place. So I have two things just to bring in. One that I'll show you that I think is clear, and then one possibility which we'll set up next week. Then you can decide for yourselves. It's fine if you just did the Gemara and Rashi and do it over and over again if you want, or you can try and go further in the sheet and figure out where I'm going, and maybe get clarity better. So the first is here's the parish of Rav Avadia bar Temurah on the Mishnah. So what does he right? So he says Akol Memirin equals Akol Matfisin Bikdushas Temurah. Oh, good. So he right. So we know that my theory about Rashi doesn't work with the bar Temurah at all. The bar Temurah is designed to make you explain the Mishnah, to understand the Mishnah according to the Maskana of the Gemara. So the first thing he does is he plugs in the paraphrase at the Gemara's Maskana into the line of Kol Memirin, which Rashi didn't do. But then he says equals, right? I put an equal sign, right? That shotefes is kedushas Temurah b'femas chulin imamar zu tachas zu shel hekdesh, and that seems like he's trying to quote Rashi. Ben al pi nashim equals, what does that mean? Kigonim hemira isha tefes kedushas Temurah al pia. So he is actually deliberately quoting Rashi, but he says kigon. So what I want to suggest is that bar Temurah is actually a textual witness. We have an emendation by an acharon to kigon. The bar Temurah already had kigon. So assuming that the text of bar Temurah, all right, the text of bar Temurah, it could be somebody else amended the text of bar Temurah, but at least it's not just an acharon, right? Speculating, like there was a point, it seems, at which that was a text of Rashi. So if I had to pick a text in Rashi, I would probably pick the kigon. The only problem is that if you look at what bar Temurah actually does, is he quotes Rashi all the way through, except that he assumes that Rashi all the way through is explaining the Maskana. And that just doesn't seem right to me. Right? Because Rashi is explaining the Havin all the way through. So I don't know what to do with this person, right? Other than as a witness. I just don't understand what I don't understand. Often bar Temurah is not quoting Rashi, he's quoting Rambam. But here he's not quoting Rambam, he's quoting Rashi. So I am baffled as to how to read this Rashi. Other possible witness we have is we have this thing called Miyuchos Rabbeinu Gershom, which I think there's a whole fight about. Is it earlier than Rashi? Is it later than Rashi? So you can make your own decision about this. What does he say? Amar Rav Yehuda, right? We only have him in this part of the Mishnah. Hachi ketani masnisin. Hakol memirin equals matfisin b'tmura equals hakol shamru tezu tachazu nitfas zeh tachazeh. Okay, fine. He reads, right? So we're in the Maskana. That's great. V'zehu perish hakol memirin below mashpid memirin lechatchila. Okay, so the Yisrael Megershom clearly believes that changing the language to matfisin somehow solves the b'di'eved lechatchila problem. So at least we can locate, right? We can locate how to solve that problem. So the problem v'hachi ketani v'lo shadam rashai le'mir kilomar afal gav da kol matfisin lo shadam rashai le'mir lechatchila. Okay, so the Michler Gershon gives us a straightforward reading of the end of the Gemara, and we have to decide whether we think that that is what we think Rashi means, or not what we think Rashi means. Because again, he seems to be quoting Rashi on the Mishnah, right, to explain the Maskana, but that's the reverse problem, Bartanura. So it could be my theory about Rashi is wrong. I just don't think that, I think that their goals to explain the Mishnah. So they don't, right? So they're not trying to explain Rashi at all. So they don't have my hangups about this at all, and they don't succeed in explaining Rashi at all. Because if Rashi were saying the things that they're saying, Rashi should just say the things they're saying. But Rashi says a lot more, or different. Okay, so I'll give you the sort of reveal at the end of the sugya as to what I think the right way to go around it, to go about it is, which may or may not solve it, is that there's another sugya, and this sugya is in Chulin. The first parak of Chulin begins Hakol Shochatin. That's all very familiar, but it says Hakol Shochatin twice. Okay, that in two different structures. One is Hakol Shochatin Ushchitas and Kshera. Oh, good. Okay, right. So now we have a 2-line framework, to which the Gemara is going to ask immediately. Hakol Shochatin lechatchila Ushchitas and Kshera diavid. So the Mishnah Chulin starts off with a structure which is exactly parallel to our Gemara structure. But there's a second Hakol Shochatin. There's no second Hakol Memirin in Temurah. What does that second Hakol Shochatin mean? So if we go to the sugya about that, and here at Chata Ayanim Eskir Hayom, I think I taught this for a year in Maimonides, but of course I never got up to Daf Tes Zayin, so I had no idea there was a second Hakol Memirin. Hakol Shochatin. So I think I got the whole sugya wrong the first time I taught this. Then when I taught it a second time, by which I had developed more of a methodological approach, particularly making sure I went through the whole parak of anything I was teaching. So I got that. Oh my gosh, I probably blew the whole sugya. In any case, so the Gemara in Chulin and Daf Tes Zayin has two options as to what the second Hakol Shochatin means. The first option is Hakol Shochatin means Hakol B'Shchita. It doesn't, right? So the first option in the Gemara is Hakol Shochatin. The first one means everybody shechts. Everybody shchita is kosher. The second Hakol Shochatin means everything needs shchita. The second option, the Gemara says Ela Marava, is that no, both Hakol Shochatin means everybody shechts, and they're coming to include different people. So you have from this sugya is an attestation that you can read the phrase Hakol, verb ending, right, verb of this tense, right, as if it meant everything, right, passively, everything has this done to it, as opposed to everybody does this. So it seems to me likely that that should show up at least as a havamina in our sugya. And that's right. And then what I hope will start showing next week is that it may be that everybody, but particularly Rashi, is reading our sugya as in light of the sugya in Chulin, and we'll see the sugya in Chulin. Right, what's the first thing the sugya in does? The sugya in Chulin does. It quotes our Mishnah in Temurah. So everyone is justified in reading our sugya and saying, "Hang on a sec, our sugya should fit with that sugya." The problem is that that the elements aren't exactly parallel. So what we're going to do next week is we're going to go through how Rashi reads that sugya, and specifically how Rashi interprets the Mishnah in that sugya. And then we're going to see that there are two other sugyot in which our Mishnah in Temurah is quoted, and we're going to go take a look at how Rashi interprets the Mishnah in each of those contexts. And we'll raise the methodological question. Right, it's often claimed that Rashi is atomistic. Rashi explains every sugya independently. Yonah Frankel didn't quite think so, and I tend not to think so. I think that Rashi doesn't give you the mechanics of how to reconcile the sugyot. That doesn't mean that Rashi isn't reconciling the sugyot. Doesn't mean that Rashi doesn't think you have to understand the sugya consistently. So we'll take a look, right? This Mishnah shows up in 4 different contexts. We'll have to try and figure out if we can align the meaning of that sugya, but a part of the alignment is, well, in at least one of those sugya, ours, there's a havamina and a maskana about how to understand the sugya. So it could be that Rashi aligns some of the sugya with the havamina and some of the sugya with the maskana. But it seems to be unlikely that that when you have a Mishnah which is quoted 3 other times in Shas, and Rashi explains the Mishnah each of those cases, it seems unlikely to me that Rashi would offer a wholly original explanation of the Mishnah in the context of our sugya. Right? Much more likely that Rashi reads our Mishnah in light of those sugyot, and maybe we can understand some of the things that Rashi is doing by comparing what Rashi does here to what Rashi does in those sugyot. So that's our shiur for this week. Right? That's right. Trying to set up the methodological approach, try to set up the problems. Right. Those of you with the shiur before know that I often don't solve the problems I set up. I don't know if I will. Right. There's no grand reveal at this point scheduled for next week where we solve everything. But I think this is how to go about it. And at the end, you might just have to you pick the best option you have, even if you haven't solved all the problems, and maybe we'll have made some advances towards figuring out what we think we should do in the next sugya, if we can, once we make methodological choices about in this one. Just to structure all the way through, though, but right, the way the Masechta works is that the first sugya really is about this Mishnah, although the first sugya goes on a lot longer than this. I don't know how much of that we'll do. And then the whole Masechta, the Perek, certainly is fun because it just takes Temurah as a model for Shas-wide sugya. Then we'll have to ask ourselves, to what extent do right, there's always a methodological question. Is the first sugya of the Perek designed to teach you everything you need to know for the rest of the Perek? Or is it just, that's a fun introduction, to forget everything you learned now because you won't understand anything if you, right, basically the first sugya is on a wholly different axis. Right, so it's not obvious that the way we understand the Mishnah in the first sugya should even impact the way we understand the Mishnah in the right, or the halacha in the following sugyot, but I would rather it did. That's just my preference. Okay, any questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
Is the idea that Rashi is explaining according to the Havamina and not the Maskana, is that like an axiom we're taking, or is that open to
I would like it to be true, right? Because I sort of committed to it myself in other contexts, like SBM for hairs and things like that. But I don't know it.
The reason I ask is because I was reading a bit ago the Dalchei Gemara of Yitzchak Kanpanton, and he says explicitly the opposite.
Okay, good to know. I didn't know that. I think that I could probably find examples that would make it hard to say that absolutely as well. But send it to me so I can see it. And I don't take it as an axiom. First of all, there is a person who claims that Rashi on Temurah is not really Rashi, so we can always get at it that way. But I don't even want to. No, I would say is that that I would like it to be true, but I'm not taking it as an axiom because I can't prove it. I've never been able to prove it. I found in my experience there are things that are better explained that way than the alternate, but there are other things that can't be explained. So maybe there's a much more complicated algorithm. I guess I would be surprised if it were consistently shown that Rashi always goes according to the Maskana, but I'm certainly open to a much more complicated algorithm in which Rashi explains according to the Maskana, except when.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe I'm wrong, right? So it's not I would say is that I take it as a valid hypothesis for the shiur, not as an axiom. Okay, thank you for the question, and send me the Kanfantun. That's probably that'll get me. Yaakov again tried to get me to read that so many years ago and failed. So now that I get Chatayim Eskirayov, I should probably have read everything Yaakov again made me read, because most of the things he had me read were really great, and so that was coming to bite me. Good, thank you very much. All right, other questions? Oh, great, thank you for coming. I will look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.